Let's talk about Spelljammer, the Astromundi Cluster, which is a campaign setting from 1993 by Sam Witt, but with the design idea is from Richard Baker, and apparently Bruce Herder was involved in planning it as well. It seems to me like it's probably chiefly Sam Witt, partly because his name is as the sole author, but also because he gives a kind of end note in one of the books which comes across a lot like, I've thought all these things. I mean, who knows? Gary Gygax does that with Oriental Adventures. In the box, you have 3 books. You have an absolute ton, probably 20 or so, just over, cards of this kind. You'll see a lot in the campaign boxes from this era. And you've got 2 maps. Apart from, I've got an advert for Dragon Strike here. Great. I like the catalogues. There's no conspectus though, which is also not, for the era you start to get conspectuses. There is a planetary display map. It's necessary to realise that you're talking about millions of miles here. This is an absolutely enormous map for scale. Does it give a, yeah. And that's one map. That's very useful. Marginally useful and also utterly hideous. One of the worst TSR maps I've seen. Early computer art. Someone has just created a bump. The bits that are cartographed in are fine. The bits that are illustrated, are painted, are awful. So that's Antle and Crystal Citadel and the world of Highport. That's literally going to be useful in those circumstances. We're not, that is a bad map. To very quickly cover these as well. You've got a primary asteroids chart, which means primary planets functionally, including round the major gas giants and the 2 suns of this one crystal sphere you're talking about. So this is, in size, relatively speaking, you're talking like a supplement equivalent to Realm Space, Grey Space, Kryn Space, which are individual books with a map. This is a whole nearly 200-page box set. Well, with these over 200-page supplement. Natural resources and imports of colonies, and then you've got ship cards. The Lance ship. They don't have the normal full stats. I think those are in one book, but they are partial. Ship cards. There's the Thoric Trader, which has 2 helms. There is an Antle and Crystal ship. There is a Doombat. Then you've got a mining bunker, picture and map. This is actually meant to. The problem with this is it's actually meant to be in a book, and it is not. There's illustrations of some big MacGuffins, and then literally then about half of this whole section, or a third of this whole section, is these things which you get in some of the books, which are NPC displays. You get 3 from each culture displayed, and you get a little caption on the back. These are, relatively speaking, waste of space. The pictures are nice enough. The art is by Eric Olson has done the booklet cover painting. David O. Miller, box cover, which is a good one. And Miller does the individual drawings. Cartography is John Connect, Diesel and Dennis Korth. But yeah, these are less good than in some products. There's no stats on them, for instance. They tend to be quite short. They don't fill the page. You can see like that. Then you have there's an encounter table. The encounter table is pretty solid, I would say. The one thing being that there's not a general procedure for it anywhere, I don't think. So you have to, you're going to have to add that yourself. There's a drawing of the Neogi fortress or trading fortress of Ironport, and then there are the 12 constellations, which are reasonably significant in the wider story or whatever of the setting. And then there are a variety of, they're all 2-sided. These will tend to have, drawing on the back of something. as well, but a couple of them are selections, are also maps, but these are colour selections of planetary displays at a kind of larger scale. The three moons of Usathandra, for instance. Those are okay. Those are useful, I think. Sometimes, even though there's not lots of game information going with them, they can be useful for orienting players. And just as a quick guide to you as the DM, the 3 books. The Astrogator's Guide is which has the cover painting on it. No, it doesn't have the cover painting on it. This has a Jeff Easley painting, which I think is used elsewhere in Spelljammer. This is a good painting. This is the sort of player-facing book, if you want to think of it like that. It gives a quick overview of the Astromundi Cluster. This is the only part of the set to be used by players directly. It has races, and the races are largely human, or there are 4 human and 3 non-human detailed, plus deities and clerics and NWPs, and then ships and equipment. And this gives a quick overview. I'll return to that. Adventures in the Shattersphere gives some details on the big meta-plotty things. Again, I'll return to that. Bunch of adventure ideas, kind of adventure seed outline style, 1 page generally. And then a list of Astromundi powers. That means the political powers, and 9 pages on how to set up a campaign. And the Celestial Almanac, which is the longest one. I mean, this is the Astrogator's Guide is 32 pages. Adventures is going to be 64, and Celestial Almanac is 96. And this has a few things. It has a couple of Tanari MC sheets. It has a few magic items, and it has a short chapter on trade and a short chapter on movement. And then most of it is about 67 pages of it is details about planets. So that, this is the guts of this is the gazetteer. Now, the Astromundi Cluster is cut off from the rest of the spheres, at least in terms of exit. You can enter, but due to magic after various historical events, you can't get out, except elves can get out. They have a valuable market in, basically because living ships can get out there. And then it's also mentioned that via hijinks, Arcane and Rygar can presumably get out. And then there is some stuff about possibly Myogi getting out, or maybe not being able to. There's never an explanation given, and that you're rapidly weakening at that point when you say just a normal species without any special reason can get out. Rygar and Arcane, obviously, weird species. So yes, it's this isolated megasphere. It's billions of square miles, has billions of people in it. And I think it's billions of square miles, but yeah, billions of people live there. There's empires, and it in lots of ways, in more than ways than one, not entirely positive, but there's some things that it reminds me of us, without being direct comparisons, are things like the Tapani sector, which is a 98 supplement, I think, for Star Wars, role-playing game, fairly late in the game for Star Wars, the role-playing game. It's certainly influenced by Dark Sun, and it mentions, of all things, it mentions you could connect the campaign via these weird scientists to Dark Sun, of all things. It also suggests you potentially use either Aurora's Whole Realms catalogue or DSR1 Dune Trader. Is it DSR1? But yeah, the Dark Sun Trader book as a basis for trading here, because trading could be quite important. You could almost feel like it's about to point you to Galaxy Guide 6 tramp freighters. It has that sense of a great era of creative game style development. I don't mean in terms of rules like, is it gold for XP versus whatever else. I mean actually across games, but where the player driven activities that might happen expand, and the scope particularly points us more to Star Wars. Spelljammer, actually, though it's space opera, is not necessarily always super Star Warsy. It's space opera, space fantasy, and so you might say, well, obviously it's Star Wars, but I think the animal ships are the giveaway, that there's a sense in which it's it's prone to actually being less operatic unless you really make an effort, and much more, I mean, and this is no bad thing whatsoever, but much more different styles of ordinary D&D, but in this very strange environment where there are things that are parallel to ordinary D&D, but with the distinction, like I've talked about this elsewhere, but the 3D hex crawl, for instance, the idea that really you need a 3D hex crawl to make these, and use the planetary displays as a tool in that, obviously, but between clusters, between spheres, and then you know, all this stuff. Whereas there's always the hint in the background, and you see this in the slightly more narrative-driven modules in the series. There's a weird thing where SGA1 is kind of all over the place. SGA2 has a few linking threads, but is mostly meant to be small adventures. SGA3 starts to hit this kind of like, here's a big story you have to go through, though it surpasses that. And then later, I think possibly 4 QS1 and whatever the other one is. Yeah, the ones that come to do with the second Unhuman War. That stuff is much more narrative driven. And has some good stuff in it, but is kind of like, here's the meta plot. Although this has aspects of that, what I mean is, in general, there is this, in Spelljammer, there's a latent grand sweep of things that could be happening, whether it's to do with political alliances or trade or archaeology, but which are only intermittently supported by the products. And it's partly because there's such a small selection of adventures, which end up being a very weird selection of adventures. Conversely, there's a bias towards gazetteer style books instead, which are sometimes good and sometimes less interesting. And it has a temp peg setting, the Spelljammer itself, which ends up being a bit of a marginal product, not very exciting. You know, it's a weird line. And the Astromundi Cluster comes along very much at the end of the Spelljammer run. Relatively, I think maybe last Spelljammer product is 94. Someone may be able to correct me without me checking manually. But it's this broad sweep of, there's by the Two Suns, there's an empire of, like in Hawkmoon, animal mask wearing, lawful evil mages, magocracy. You know, they're Glantry. Glantry probably also influenced by Moorcock, I suspect. But this kind of like, great military power in there. And then you go out, and then there's the Inner Ring of Asteroids, which is heavily populated nowadays and kind of is a link between places. And then you go further out towards the fringe. There's Gas Giant, which has basically been taken over by an Illithid empire who have made, this is very Dawn of the Overmind later on, made all the moons stable behind it, static behind it, so they're covered from the Two Suns, and they're perfect for the Illithids. And there's all these human cultures. There's sort of Russian-y types who are potentially Russian into Romany, basically bluntly Slavic stereotypes of different forms, and pseudo-Slavic, Slavic adjacent stereotypes of different forms, some of whom serve the Illithids, some of whom are independent. Callidian traders, kind of these, I suppose, much more Anglospheric, independentists. There's Nordic, are they called the Thorics, Nordic type adventurers. And there's elves who are, and this again, maybe this stuff points, certainly some of it points forward to some Star Wars stuff, or contemporary Star Wars stuff, but also it seems influenced by Dark Sun. You've got typically grey-haired, highly mercenary dwarves. You've got revanchist elves who are somewhat savage. You know, they're not literally Grugak, but they're sort of semi-wild in many ways. And everyone has a plot. Everyone's got up to something. You have even the dwarves, you know, minor faction, are actually trying to become so indispensable that eventually they can start asserting political authority via their mercenaries. The Arcane have made a deal, just an innocent deal, just a deal they intend to honour. There's even a point made, this doesn't for them breach their neutrality. They are still being true neutral because they're attempting to fulfil a deal. But it's that they made a deal with the Tanari to create a gate to the abyss via the central sun, which they're drawing energy from to create this gate to this. That actually threatens the sun imploding, like going nova. The Illithids, on the other hand, simply want to turn the suns off, both suns. They want to make something called the Sun Slayer. all these vast plots, all these little things, and there's all this vast scope of places. It is the very quick overview, and I'll try to go into a bit more detail without probably being too exhaustive, because there's just too much and it's hard to summarize. But I think the high level thing is this is very nearly one of the best middle period TSR products. In fact, let's just say generally, it's very nearly one of the best TSR D&D, and therefore all D&D products. It is chock full of ideas, is magnificent in its scope. There's so many things you can do, and Witt just says, look, you could do this, maybe you could do this, you can have a campaign about this, what about this? There are some shortfalls, and I think I'll summarise them now before the survey side of it, partly to save me hopefully doing that too much during the survey. One, there are a plethora of editing and layout issues, editing just errors, repetitious information not being cut properly, grammatical errors, a map that being presumed to be in the book but in fact being in the cards, things like that. In terms of layout, there's a whole thing where stuff is often separated. You have 5 rooms associated with one set at the inner ring. That are not on a table, it's just 5 rumours you could drop in. The assumption is rumours could be helpful. But there's also all sorts of little rumours in the back half of the almanac, which are just on the bottom in the classic Spelljammer bars. Or you get across the Spelljammer and you see these black bars at the bottom with text. And these black bars across these are variously used, some effectively, some not. Often within character talks by people about what the culture thinks, which are kind of interesting. They're marginal. But certainly these rumours aren't unhelpful, but they're in completely the wrong place. They're not usable as a rumour table. Lots of odd decisions like that. But really, it all comes from the fact that there is, 192 pages in these books, plus another 40 or more or whatever in the cards. And it's a 240-page product, basically. But this really, from the sheer amount of content, based on the writing style, I'll actually mention that in a second, but really needs to be a 300 or 400 page book. That sounds crazy, I understand, but we're talking about something which is, you add together all the books from the Gaz series or something. Oh yeah, that's the whole of the known world or whatever. That would actually come out to longer than 400 pages, but the principle is that this is not really one product. It's much bigger than one product. Hence why it's a box set, and a deluxe box set with a ton of extra materials, but it's so epic and massive that it simply cannot be contained, and it means lots of ideas are addressed briefly, brushed over. Ideas are given about how to do stuff. A dungeon summary with like a basic key is put up, but there's not much there. Not all the ideas are equally good. I don't want to pretend that. It's not simply lack of space. But the lack of space probably exacerbates the fact that you're like, oh, this is a great idea, but I've got to add to it myself. And DMs should do that. Some DMs would say, well, look, I need a bunch of ideas. Give me the ideas, I'll make the story. Great. You make the world based on the ideas. And it's not as if this is uncommon in this very era. I've mentioned the Tapani sector. There's plenty of that in the Tapani sector where as to locations, you're getting a couple of page planet summaries. You've got to come up with everything else. That's very standard, actually, throughout Star Wars D6. It's pretty standard throughout the era. And this is an era of mass production of RPG products and the assumption that you need to get more out. And they don't actually necessarily always need to be super detailed. You get city books, but you also get plenty of regional gazetteers. And I'm not even entirely against that, even though I think it's a very odd period for RPGs. It's the heyday, but it's also greatly decadent. But yes, that is a problem. A problem that exacerbates it is what we call the 90s RPG gazetteer writing style. It's weird how I was having echoes of books not written by Sam Witt as I read it, of some Deadlands books, though without the house style of Western slang. I was getting hints of some World of Darkness books where they're slightly less intentionally dark and grimly written and kind of almost arch eyebrows. I was being reminded of Star Wars, particularly, I was also reminded of a book I actually really love. I think it's a great book, Platt's Starport Guide by, I think, is Eric Troutman a co-writer on that one? And then Patricia something writes Black Sands of Socorro. Socorro is a less good gameable product, but an amazing inspiration book. But yeah, a thing where it's meant to be semi-technical writing. You're meant to be being told, okay, so these are the things you need to run the game. But it's also meant to be, it's chatty, informal, and quite padded out. And I think in the almanac, I think there's one good example of this, where you kind of clock that everything. There's one point where you're like, oh yes, I think it's here we are. I think it might be when it's talking about the Shackleman group. Yeah, the Shackleman group of Antilan, the Sun Mages, their base. It might be another one, but yeah, where you realise stuff like the dungeon. Despite the strict Antilan principle of loyalty, someone does occasionally step out of line. Those who do are sent here to think upon the error of their ways and repent. Prisoners captured in or near the Shackleman group are also brought here until they can be dealt with. The dungeon is very secure, but like most prisons, has very little defence against someone trying to break in rather than out. This has allowed the Elves of Bavarian to stage 2 jailbreaks in recent memory. They managed to liberate 2 of their most famous pirates during these raids. That is about 8 times the length that needs to be. So Witt is not actually mostly a baggy writer. There are points in the Astrogator's Guide, and I think somewhat in Adventures too, where he's quite disciplined. I remember reading the Astrogator's Guide and thinking, this is some of the most disciplined writing in terms of density and compaction in the mid-TSR era. That doesn't apply to the Almanac. And so when you already have this writing style, which is a bit baggy in itself, it's also kind of, it's not really good enough, because you either, like, I think if you're going to take the extra words, you've got to write well, beautifully. The best World of Darkness stuff, if you want stuff that kind of gets your mind going, you've got these beautifully written bits in World of Darkness books that you realise, there's actually an artistic talent here. Not necessarily game design talent, but it gives you ideas. This writing style I'm talking about doesn't necessarily do either. But it becomes especially culpable if you waste the words you do have. You're already becoming baggy, and so when you expand that out to... It's a dungeon. The thing is just a dungeon. They put people there. That's it. You could say dungeon. Recently has been raided by elves twice to free their own pirates. Given you're not adding a map, well, in fact, what's with the extra, I don't know, 6 sentences, 8 sentences you're freeing up there, you could put more detail in about the garrison. But yeah, those are the endemic problems. The endemic strengths, though, this broad sweeper there. Let's go through the books. The art, by the way, I won't comment on it too much unless there's something I particularly love, mostly by Miller, is, all very competent and pleasant. He's a good artist. And they are mostly drawn, obviously, to commission for things that are mentioned. Looks like it's a tradesman versus a dragonfly and a mine spider by a gas giant. It's a really nice piece, actually. It's an interesting thing not having it be the amazing Easley paintings. But it's... or Brom. Basically, Easley and Brom are Spelljammer, but I think Miller does a very good job with... Because that, I think, is Miller as well, isn't it? That's the... For instance, of capturing something of that... that Spelljammer feel. But yeah, you have a history here. You then have summaries of the nations. So these are 2 pages each, or 1 page each. Antilans are 2, Illithids and their Varan allies 1.5. Callidians a column, Neogi a column. This is what I mean. This is disciplined. You do have vast populations. So, for instance, there are 1 billion Neogi, 1 billion Callidians in American billions, 800 million dwarves, 1.5 billion Thoric, 3 billion Illithids. The Antilans, presumably, 3 billion. I mean, in a sense, they're weirdly round figures, but the Illithids and their worst enemies both have 3 billion people or whatever. But yeah, you're talking about vast populations over a vast area, and a bunch of the dynamics that are being set up are different to normal. It's rather than it being that the elves, that's one thing, Spelljammer elves, I like the Imperial Elven Navy, but it is just high elves in space with an ever more arrogant twist in very cool living ships. Equally, similarly, dwarves go around in mountain citadels, things like that. And so an inspiration from Dark Sun here is obviously the spin. Nyogi just mostly want to trade. They're not actually like crazily evil. They are evil, basically. There's some question. The Nyogi are a reasonably trustworthy group of traders. Outright saying they're just different here. The Illithids are, though they're basically sinister, they're not good. They're not good guys. They are the Nyogi you can deal with. You could get along with them indefinitely. The Illithids, no, you can't. But the Illithids, again, they are nonetheless, for most of the time, if you're just trying to negotiate with them, they're lawful evil, and they run a political empire, and they're just more or less predictable in that sense. The elves and the lizardmen are really crushed down and beaten and hiding and semi-savage. The lizardmen have gene pool problems with isolated gene pools of isolated colonies who need to really mix again. Elves they have the unique technology to get out in terms of for normies who aren't arcane or Rygar, but they also, they're very much on the back foot. They've been damaged by the Unhuman War, the first one, and so on, and have to fight the goblinoids who find their way in. Yes, there is then the races are interesting and they're summed up quickly and easily. This is a great book, as I say, for that. Celestial features, again, you've got like a paragraph summing up a whole planet. Constellations, a nebula on the outside, then the fringe. Some stuff within the fringe, the Great Belt. That's something some of these are destroyed planets. There's very, very few, relatively speaking, regular spherical planets. There are some spherical moons on the gas giants. That's really where they are. The fringe and the Great Belt are both full of non-spherical planets, irregulars, cluster planets, amorphous planets. You then have Trinona coming in which is an air sphere. Then has with a single moon, and some other clusters and so on, asteroid things going around. Boyani, Thunderland, which is actually a sphere, rare sphere. Calamar, gas giant, which has some moons which have been mostly taken over by Illithids from the Callidians. The Dark Group coming further in, which is mixed kind of between various political powers. The Glacier, another asteroid belt, which is very cold. Diamad, air sphere, homeworld of the Beholder races. Not all of these actually properly detailed in the almanac. I think some of them are just like, there's so much again, they're just left for you. Usathandra, the home of the Illithids, another gas giant. The Varan Group, another which is a group within is a group of asteroids on its own arc, on its own orbit. Chakrak, Illiman, the Inner Ring. You're now getting into the heart of things, which is where the Callidians, the Antilians. This is the most heavily populated area. This is a classic place, one of many classic places for adventures to start. And Mordan is gas giant held by the Sun Mages and Callidians. Nebula. Then you get really close in the Golden Girdle, and the Shackleman Group and the Islands of the Sun. The Islands of the Sun are actually between the two suns, which are Antlion. They are kind of the heartland of the Empire. Now, in terms of the races, do we have a single chart for this? No. So you have Antlions, no changes to attributes, but they always have extra first level spells for their mages, and you get you can become, there might be nobility benefits. All character classes are available to Antlions, they don't get specifically sun magic, but they can be mages. They're very flexible and they're basic humans, but they're not necessarily very popular everywhere else. Callidians add con and strength, subtract dex and wisdom, and they might have some bards and priests, no thieves, but they can have either mercenary or merchant. Of course, given you are appointed eventually, one of these organisation issues, it's not mentioned here, to trader, to June trader, you could also go to Havens of the Great Bay. Is that the birthright supplement with Brecht traders? Yeah, so it's basically saying these people should be fighters or merchants or traders or possibly thieves or bards. The Thoric are really into fighting and bards and clerics. Mages are virtually unknown as the Thonicists. They add 2 decks, they subtract 2 decks, add strength. They're big and burly. The Clydians are strong and tough, but slow and unwise. The Varans, on the other hand, they add dexterity, they remove strength and charisma. Then you've got dwarves and elves who are standard, but there's just a few kind of like cultural differences explained, and the lizardmen similarly. And then deities. The deities are, you're told to point to legends and lore and complete priests to create specialty priesthoods, which are not mentioned here. The dwarves have, I think do they worship Moradin, possibly? The elves don't speak of their religion or their religion or goddess. The lizardmen have a god, but only pay lip service. The Illithids have but a single god rather than an entire pantheon of Illithid gods. And the whole point is there's an avatar of Lugrabosk active in the cluster. The human gods correspond to gods of grounding pantheons. And so you have Pyrax, who is Aztec deity Omiateotl. Munagir, Norse Fry. Galenicus, Norse Hell. Seltine is Egyptian Set, or Egyptian, I think. Hordant is Norse Thor. Tradaphos is Celtic Manannan Machlir. Yule is Greek Hades. Fiera is Indian Savitri. Kodak is not Moradin but Clangadin, so that's the dwarven god. Regis Wajek is the elven god Solonor Thalandira, so not Corellon, interestingly. Sestasa is the lizardman god who has no priests. And Lugrabosk, Lord of the Illithids. So again, a pretty efficient god section. It doesn't give you specialty priesthoods. I approve of them. Remember, they go back to the Greyhawk box set. They are a thing that was in Gary's mind. But it's interesting. Again, there's an attempt to spin this away from the classic kind of, this is the Forgotten Realms. This is the Rock of Brawl, even, where you have the spelljamming, spacefaring religions and religious distinctives, but they're on a spectrum. Here, you're being alienated mostly with human deity gods who you'd get from legends and lore if you wanted to directly adapt. NWPs, you're told, I think, just to use mostly the normal ones. Giving some guides about what equipment people might have. Few ships, crystal ships used by Antons, Doombats used by elves, which is an assault craft. Thoric tradesmen, which is a double helm, special to a big thing being that it's not a series helm. It is there are more than one helm to the vessel. Very rare technology, makes them very quick. Clydians with very small, easy, high maneuverable smugglers' vessels. Here, this is the mindset in Spelljammer, which should point us to, and almost certainly is influenced by, or eventually influenced by, not immediately, but by 1990s Trump freighters, of all things by Mark Reinhagen and Stuart Wyek. But you can see that that's something which is in the background of a lot of people thinking at the time, post Star Wars particularly, and maybe post Dune as well. And so, the Thoric tradesman, the lance ship, so on and so forth. These should point you towards these, the idea of the space opera, the Trump freighter space opera. Some weapons and equipment, which are just interesting things to do with stuff that might be useful for boarding, for instance, arm blades, so that you can't lose your weapons, and very useful for cutting boarding lines or whatever. Adhesive bolts for crossbows, cable slides, which is a metal spool with a wooden handle, which you can use for boarding. Again, so that points you not to the Trump freighter, but to the pirate. So in terms of Pirates and Privateers, which I think that was 97, I think that's much later for Star Wars. The Adventures in the Shattered Sphere. This is DM facing, and it gives a short 9 pages discussion. It's okay. It's a good discussion. I quite liked it on campaign starts, all kinds of places. Like a particular thing, for instance, is there's several pages on what home port to start with. Well, you could start in the Fringe with bizarre creatures of wild space in Fringe. Oh, sorry. You could start out in the Fringe. You can start in the Inner Belt. It says the Inner Belt is maybe the #1 place to go. It's the biggest place of population. I guess it's like being on the Inner Rim, or in the Fringe, or maybe even in some of the colonies in Star Wars. You become traders, mercenaries. More violent, wilder sort. A Thoric trading settlement out in the Fringe could be your base. You could go all the way into the Golden Girdle and could be throw yourself into the Sun Mage and Arcane conspiracies. High danger, sneakiness. Or you could be allies to the Sun Mages. You start there and it's your home base because you're employed by the Antilans. That's very Thoric, isn't it? Look, there's some Norse guys trying to shoot a polar bear with a wheel lock. It's not a wheel lock, actually. It's a flintlock in that case. You could start in the Varan group or in the Dark group. Harder, more Illithid focused. The Trinona area has Callidians, so you could start in a fairly free area. Give some ideas about that. Start amongst dwarves. Start at Ironport, a dangerous home port, but Highport, which is not run by the Neogi but by the Arcane, albeit the Neogi trade from there. These big, so think like the Rock of Braal, but perhaps more dangerous, or think like some of the stations in Platt Starport Guide. Or the Great Belt is you're an explorer. Lots of ideas. This thing, there's loads of ideas. You kind of actually think that, again, when you're talking about lost space in other sections, or when you're thinking about the cards, the wasted cards, possibly the thing to do. This cover is by Eric Olson. Space battle between a Nautiloid, a hammer ship, a mine spider. There is a dragonfly out there as well. This is probably the least good of the 3 cover paintings. There's still good Miller internal art. That is a Varan serving his Illithid master, who's telling him what to say, or instructing him to translate. And in fact, he is the in-character person who's speaking the first section of these, through the first several pages. There just tons of ideas, and you think when you're talking about the wasted space elsewhere, that'd be the thing you'd want. It also gives short-term goals and long-term goals. Short-term goals: power, discovery, escape, independence, wealth, truth, the ruins of the Dark Group, our own business, the way out, slaves. Campaign goals could be you're the founding fathers of a colony, and it gives you like 6 stages of things you need to do to build a colony. You want to help the lizardmen find a new home world. You're against the Arcane or the Illithids in their big plots. It gives examples of building story arcs. Now, that's one thing, is there is the tension you get in a lot of the really good products of this era. There are a few great products of this era, but there is mostly, like between 96 when Cordell turns up and going back 86, 87, 88, there is a real dearth of absolute top tier products. There are a lot of second tier products, very good second tier products, and this is there. But many of them, Night Below is top tier, to be fair, in that period. But in that second tier, really good stuff, but there's often a tension between, here's a way to run a war game type D&D game like first edition. I talked about this in my some time ago Spelljammer box set review, that Jeff Grubb is big into giving you systems. He's big into the idea that this is actually almost a first edition setting, albeit it's released for second edition. But they also just say, also you could use these encounters whenever you want. Just spring them on the characters. This is how you build a story arc. So they have to do this and they have to do this because you told them to. And the big meta plot things, the Sun Death and the Dark Gate, though I think they are doable as campaign things, it's okay to have a big MacGuffin quest as a thing that players want to do. They are easily set up as things where the DM tells the players what to do. This does allow both styles of play, which is better than some products, but I think it shows the tension. Then you get a summary of the various powers in much more detail than in the other book, and these are okay. They're not particularly overwritten. They're generally 3-4 pages. I think the Antilans are 3 pages, for instance. The Arcane 2, just under 2. The Illithids just over 2. And they just describe the secret plots and the things that groups within each want to do. These are again good. It might be nice to have a table with layouts and laying out what they do. There's some Nyogi having a fight. It might be nice to kind of have some summary somewhere of what they're all doing. Basically, that's one thing. Faction games. This is actually one thing you sometimes get with some story games and new school games, that the sometimes overemphasis on layout has led, at least sometimes, to people realizing you do need to actually sum up what all these people want to do. You do need a list of, and that's only a parallel, obviously, but with it tends to be with factions and plots, but to orders of battle. And just like you need orders of battle in dungeon adventures and combat adventures, you also need orders of battle equivalent for factions. These are, I would say, sometimes there's some interesting stuff like Nyogi Ritual Combat. That's interesting. It's sometimes a bit overwritten in terms of it has the 90s gazetteer style writing, and it just means there's a lot of redundant, banal text. The Thoric are friendly with any race that welcomes them, which is nearly all others. They are the only reliable source of water, ice asteroids, so are welcome wherever they decide to put in. This keeps them safe as well, because no one wants to jeopardise a friendly source of water. Quite repetitive, quite flowery, but with that being beautiful. Callidians, the Dowar, who are just, again, he's dumped everything here. These are like, they want to use the Callidians to make their way up into the big trading powers, and they're going to dump the Callidians. You have a Callidian with a Dowar there, obviously. Dwarves, dwarves, lizardmen, beholders, and elves and goblinoids. Other races, it does mention, so Rygar, it mentions they could come to help the Illithids or search for a gem, or in a particular shade of blue. They can enter and leave the Astromundi Cluster. Talks about great dreamers, space sea giants, who could be reasonably significant, spreading the word of Patar. Plasmoids, Zix Chill, mentioning other quite distinctive, cool Spelljammer Ancestries races. Only Zix Chill there can be PCs, I think. But yeah, introducing other stuff. The adventure ideas are marginal. They are marginal. They're okay, I would say. There's quite a few. One thing to praise the adventure outlines is that there are like 8 of them, but they're a couple of pages each, and they're not necessarily very exciting. And the Little Lost Tradesman is the Nyogi want a Lost Thoric Tradesman. This, to be fair, this one is actually solid because there are like multiple factions who want stuff in it. There's the Nyogi who have sent you. There's dwarves sent by Thorics to retrieve the vessel. There are goblinoids who had wrecked the vessel, hiding on it, waiting for more victims. The Thorics obviously are better than the Nyogi, but the Nyogi are the people offering the job out to open tender, so the players might be interested in it. It's also an easy one to put on a rumour board, though you need to put it on a timer if you are going to do that. You could always have, one thing is most of this stuff, there's occasionally stuff mentioned for kind of low to mid levels. I think, for instance, Little Lost Tradesman is 4 to 6 low to mid level characters. I can't see this being a first level party, but not even second. So for instance, there are 15 goblins led by a Scrow captain, and there is a party of dwarves who will fight you if they think if you say you're here to retrieve it as well, especially if you say you're retrieving it for the Nyogi. There is a thing about a cargo being a contemplator from the constellations, who they live in the constellations guarded by weird things, who gives you a prophecy, so it can set up the campaign in terms of giving you the biggest thing that's going on the players can engage with. But the players always set things like that. If you want a sandbox campaign, be willing to set stuff like that on a long timer, Put it on a timer. Time records are important, so times are important. But I say that. It depends what the threat is. If it is a world-ending plot, you need to have something that's not 15 years in the future. If it's something irritating and dangerous that draws the players in, or that coincides with other parts of their interests, and example of this is Tomb of Annihilation has a Serarak and the Soulmonger in Omu, the Ruins of Omu. I restricted the effects of that so it's less obnoxious to sandbox play, but the way that affects the landscape becomes truer the closer you get to Omu, and it's not going to rapidly become worse. There's nothing where it's getting rapidly worse, but it's something where, because it coincides with things the players will care about, the city of Omu, they're drawn towards it. So you can put stuff that isn't pushing and marching on, but it's also worth saying many things will have timers on them. And so these metaplot things, if you want to avoid making them an episodic story where the players have to go and MacGuffin quest to find the right things to defeat the enemy, you put it on a timer, but put it on a long timer. And the internal calendar does do a 2-year I think a 2-year calendar on that possibly. Gives you follow-up adventure ideas. The Dizentar, there's a Dizentar sent by Batezu to kill the Arcane, because the Arcane are trying to help the Tanari. The Blood War is mentioned here and is brought in as a potentially major element prior to Planescape, obviously following on from MC8 Outer Planes. And that's interesting. Again, Witt is just taking everything he's read. He's just consumed all this stuff. There's a very vague idea of the Dizentar tracking down Arcane on Highport. It needs much more detail. Frozen Secrets, there's some bizarre artifacts. And it says, this is a classic D&D adventure, but you're going to have to get cold weather gear, etc. And get a rather unscrupulous Thoric mercenary to help you. You then find people who might be willing to help you against the Sunslayer, but by that they're ghosts. It's flavourful, very specific. Pale Witchlight, there's some Witchlight Marauders who have activated and want to. They're only tertiary Marauders, but they want to find Goblinoids to help. And you've got to fight them, or not fight them, or retreat. Options might include, that the Goblinoids turn up. Of course, none of this is put on timers. This is just a vague outline. Maybe you could do this. The Pens of the Illithid, you could start. This really should be a campaign starter. You become slaves of the Illithids. You have to find friends and escape. That's a great campaign starter. You can have a whole adventure at first or second level based on that, with some assistance from a Callidian hidden, their terrorist service of freedom fighters or whatever, hidden there. The Dowar's service, they want you to get the black egg off some Neogi. The black egg is vital to the metaplot stuff. That's okay, but again, not very much detail. The Egg of Night, that's it. Trade route, you need to set up a trade route. Virtually no details on that. This just describing the dangers that it's just over one column, that might attend for setting up a trade route. The Almanac has some trade route information in it. Among the masked ones, go to a Antelan stronghold to get a slave right. That's interesting, and it has some good ideas in it, and it has some procedures, things that might happen, things that the bad guys might do. Then has the metaplot stuff, and the metaplot things. The adventure ideas, there's a couple which are actually quite good. There's a couple which could be repurposed, and there's a couple that are too vague, or like there's nothing there, even if it's not bad, or they're not very interesting, or they're too specific. The final 2 chapters there, I'll sum up quickly. The Sun Death and the Mystery of the Arcane are the metaplot stories. My biggest problem with these is, I think that it's quite clever, the idea that you have the Illithids doing a version of what they start doing in Dawn of the Overmind. I don't know if, I kind of assume that Bruce Cordell had read this. But trying to put out the sun to make everything nice for them so they can conquer everywhere. It also would deactivate the Sun Mage's sun powers. The thing is with the Arcanes, because they're helping make the central sun stronger, albeit not for very kind reasons in the end, they're helping the Antelans. These are symmetrical, and they're both MacGuffin quests. Both people want to make an item, and you have to go and find magic items for it. What it means is the 2 biggest things both look the same, and are opposed to each other. And in fact, they even involve, because the Egg of Night can be used to help solve both, they even involve like similar items, the same items. It means they're not bad ideas individually, together, and especially just with the fact that you're not generally you get a list of the items needed and where they might be found, so you as the DM can place them. Again, this is more you reading a Dragon magazine article, a Dungeon magazine article, not even an adventure, just an article or ideas about how to build a campaign. So that they're weak, relatively speaking. So yes, Adventures in the Shattered Sphere is all over the place, with solid stuff about building a campaign, okay stuff about the political powers, some okay adventure ideas, but it's declining, and then some weak, not awful, but weak metaplot stuff. The Almanac is obviously the biggest amount of meat, and it's dry. The Almanac itself is dry, but it's not bad. There are, whiz shades are behind the selective egress aspect of the crystal sphere, we're told. The fact that, that there are rules for this. There's also a desire by the Illithys to use the whiz shades in their evil plan. Other planes, cluster space bobs in a boundary region where the barriers between the planes are weak. I think it's that possibly, certain barriers are erected against the outer planes, and the abyss in particular. So it's harder to contact the outer planes, though you still can. You could travel to the astral moderately easily to get up there, and you can go to the inner planes. And you can't escape the cluster as it is via the astral. It might, in the future, you may be able to due to the metaplot stuff, but you can't now due to the whiz shades. There's some stuff about planetary movement and ship movement, some rules, some general comments on asteroid types, living asteroids, gastroids, animate asteroids, bone clusters, which are just clumps of skeletons. That is a hilarious and awful idea. Navigational hazards, gravity wells, infinity vines, sargassos, temporal fuses, undead, vents, wild zones, wrinkles, which are teleport points, basically wormholes. This is a good idea. Some of this does get mapped onto stuff on the map, but other parts are not mapped onto the map. They're just, So that's all a bit vague, but they're useful. Great ideas. There are mechanics with them. Then gives details of 5 prime routes of trade routes. A summary of piracy, though it's not really long enough. An economy which is based on hammered bars, which are 1 GP to 1 gold bar, albeit if you bring coins in because you travel from the outside, because an option for starting the campaign is that you're already spell jamming and you get stuck, and you might be just trying to get out again. The normal conversion is 3 coins to the bar. That's not a bad mid-sized adventure, is it? Without getting into all the other stuff for an ongoing Spelljammer campaign. I think there's a map on one of the maps, one of the cards in there possibly, or is it in one of the books, which does show the relationship of the various spheres to each other. There's a commodities list. This is a trading list, hence why it's under trading piracy. And what does lamp oil cost per gallon, or jade per square yard, or lead per pound? That's really useful for that kind of stuff. It does talk about finished goods, process, selling wholesale versus selling raw product, etc. It doesn't look like a Miller painting. I guess it must be. There's a couple of nice drawings. That one is, I think that is in Highport, possibly. This is also where it mentions in that section about looking at June Trader or at Aurora's Horror's catalogue for running a trading campaign. Witt obviously, again, much like he thinks, there's this, I mentioned this really, but there's this blood war thing, but he's also saying, no, you can run a trader campaign and you need the right resources for it. You then have a very long section, like I say, over 60 pages on the planets. This tends to be overwritten, though there are good ideas, infinity vine clusters of elf cities. Each of them has many of them, not every one of them, has an NPC. So the first one on the elven planet of Avarian is Asungi Lantos. I don't think I can get that to focus well enough. These are mostly not very interesting, these NPCs. Some are okay. Boyani, those are the independent Varans who aren't ruled by the Illithids, and there's one of their leaders. She is, she's got a medallion of ESP, but she's kind of top of the plots for trying to free Boyani from Illithid rule. Sorry, other Varan. Calamar, which this is where there's this missing map that's in one of the cards instead. There are these moons of this gas giant, which the Illithids and Varans have taken over, and some Kaladins resist on. There's a few dwarven asteroids in the internal politics, and each of these will say, and this is, by the way, great, you know, there are always adventure hooks. They're not always very strong. You'd much rather every single one had a, this character may offer this for PCs to do this. But let's say you had a couple of hooks for each that were like in that format, you know, rumour style format or job board format. They don't. They're much more general, and that's not that's not untypical, atypical of this era of TSR writing. I find it in Birthright books as a good example where, because the writer is aware there are so many things that could happen, they don't give lots of detail on what might happen, because they're like, look, you need to deal with all these contingencies. And actually, it's very helpful when you're getting started just to have a few ideas. You're paying someone to give you ideas, and that can include for a particular quick off-the-shelf, here, let's run an adventure. There's some extra weapons for the rogue dwarven colony of Chakarak. Stuff about the constellations and the weird contemplators there with their tender guardians. Dalmania, the kind of home of the Dowar, with their Kalidian allies, future slaves or whatever. The Dowar are presented strangely here, and I'm not convinced by it. It is interesting seeing them, the Neogi, the Kalidians and others in these kind of trade wars. The Arcane obviously also traders who help run a trading port. So this kind of big trade emphasis is a big thing. Sometimes it's presented in kind of greed is good, Gordon Gekko-ish, they're the bad guys kind of terms. In other times, like on the Inner Belt, you are kind of told, well, actually, this is what keeps the peace. The Neogi Agreement, or whatever it's called, keeps the peace. And so it allows flourishing. And you think, oh, there's a balance and a kind of interesting attempt to deal with this there. And you've got a mage there, Drakengard, classic Thoric place made of ice. The Golden Girdle, Hatha is a ice moon. Highport, which is this odd one that's been built up by the Arcane. Highport gets a couple of paragraphs per section. It's not as good as absolutely equivalent products. I mean, say in terms of just as a single location, it doesn't get the detail that Platt's Starport Guide, you know, gets for each of its locations, because that's a whole chapter each. And it'd be helpful, I think. You kind of want, maybe Highport should be its own chapter. Maybe one of these books, maybe you give up, you know, some of the stuff to more adventures, or you give up some of the stuff to having longer sections on big locations. Highport, as it, you know, has 3 pages. It's not nothing. In fact, it might be more than that. No, it's 3.5 pages. You know, plus an NPC. Depressed Drakon who you could become friends with and help and have a Drakon friend. You then get, at this point in the second half of this, you for a while also get very small planets given a 1-sentence thing. That's not unhelpful, except again, you kind of, you know, there's no single chart in here with a sort of, or based on, come next to the map of the heavenly bodies. You get a single sheet there of one of these cards, which you need to compare. So some of it, maybe there's added confusions about where things are or how to use them, perhaps. You then get, within the Inner Belt, you get loads of planetary descriptions, and then you also get an additional 11 small planets. You then also get the Grim regions as a subsection, but with 5 rumours to do with it. So, you know, there's a real attempt to put lots of material out there. Sam Witt did write plenty of stuff for about 10 years, but this has the feel of a magnum opus. And I think that's probably fair, that this, looking at his other work, there's not anything very major. And I suspect this is this thing where he was told to write a 200-page book, more or less, and just threw everything at it, too much at it. Yeah, you've got a Lizardman place with loads of Is it this is where the Shadow Stone is or something? Yeah, you've got Illiman, which is the Neogi homeworld where you can go to view their weird rituals, which actually summon, I don't know if it's avatars or the extension of the powers of their gods, so they can perform basically miracles, crazy big miracles. That's weird and cool. The Neogi as a fleshed out culture, who's still basically evil actually, but with a veneer of functionality, is really interesting. The Isle of Banshees, yeah, that's by someone called Abrams. I'm not sure which Abrams that is, but there's an old vampire there. This is a keyed adventure location, a regular Earth thing. There was an asteroid going around, being driven by mages, and then one of the mages tried to take over. There's a war. He ascended to Lichdom, but in a very trapped way. And there's lots of undead and lots of weird stuff. There is one of the 4 broken towers of power, which has a gigantic good plant golem rosebush thing in it. So it's interesting. It's one of the longer sections, and it shows he's got all these ideas. But again, despite being longer, there's not lots to do there. You wander around. Each place has a thing. There's piles of skeletons. Loads of the ruins. 6 of the ruins, you're told to just come up with whatever you like for them. And underneath one of them, there's the Underlab, and underneath that is the engine room. But you're like, so 6 of the locations you actually put on it, you don't get any details for. Other than that, underneath one, there is the 9th and 10th location, or no, the 11th and 12th locations. Okay. Yeah, you keep going through. The Shacklemans is, again, I gave this as an example of overwritten. It's also not a particularly attractive or interesting map. That it gives a cross section of the biggest one, which is the one which has this awful dungeon description. Then a few more places, including the Illithid basis, Uthasandra. Makes me think of the Kandras and so on, of not of Mistborn, but of the Planetary Trilogy, the Ransom Trilogy by C.S. Lewis. Thorkandra, Malacandra. There's a gang of vampires somewhere else. They're not actually on the Isle of Banshees. Where are they? They're in the Shacklemans, aren't? No, they're on a mine of Uthasandra. Are they in a ruin inside the gas giant? Because of course the gas giant, depending on where you are, can be breathable because they're air bodies. Then we finish up with some rules about sun magic, some bonus sun magic spells. There is a fairly grim but fun Miller paint picture of a sun mage in a dragon mask, looks like, killing a bunch of people. This is where you have these rumours, by the way, again, keyed to nothing. You get a couple of magic items, you get crystal citadels, and that refers you to that map, the ugly map. Then it has this weird sign, I mean, interesting sign off by Sam Witt, obviously, like, I'm just trying to give you loads of ideas. Really interesting way he puts it. What have I done here? I've given you the tools that you'll need to expand on what's in the box, because of course it's too small, he says. Everything you need to start is in the box. Heroic races battling against oppression, savage elves with a secret everyone wants, evil mages bent on conquest, an unexpected enemy of all life everywhere, and much more. Want to put Doar in charge of their own asteroid belt somewhere outside the inner ring? Go for it. A place where the earth is hunted monsters? Why not? There's plenty of room for it. Of course, that's aimed at the DM, but there's also this idea of possibility. You end up with 3 types of Tanari, Babao, Kazme, and Nabasu, which, yeah, are bone demons, fly demons, and Nabasu are kind of shadowy ones, are they? Oh, they're the gargoyling ones. Yeah, so what to say about it that I haven't said? I mean, I've said plenty, perhaps more than enough. I think it is a good product. It has hints of greatness in the scope, in the reinvention, in some of the ways that information is summarised at points, and the willingness to be disciplined about that, which collapses elsewhere. The scope for sandboxing, and the sheer number of things you could do here that could occupy you. If this were the only setting published for Spelljammer, you could do, infinite campaigns with it. You would not run out of Spelljammer campaign ideas with this. With this dark sunish, it's not as dark as Dark Sun, but this dark sunish spin on Spelljammer. It's often said to have come too late to save the day despite being popular, and it's deservedly popular. I think there are these endemic flaws which Witt cannot conquer. Richard Baker, whose apparently design concept this was, Baker at his best pushed just about through them, though you see in Rock of Bra, which is an early Baker product about the same time as this, you see that he is wrestling against it. You see in Birthright, he tries to blow the seams of it a little bit as well, by being like, what happens if we just have this very strange different setting? That it doesn't quite escape things that are very true of adventure design. Most adventure design between about 88, 89 and 96. There is not the genius here to escape that, but it is good. And if you're going to run Spelljammer, if you're looking for a place to run Spelljammer, this is a really very good setting. If you've read it or run it, please tell me what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear your war stories, and I'll see you next time.